Good morning, everyone. Welcome again for another LaSalle Sustainability Lectures. And today, we would have our first lecture for 2026. It is entitled, Can Basalt Applications in Plantations Decarbonize the Palm Oil Industry? But before we officially start, by the way, I'm Ari Sobando. I'm the Assistant Dean for Research and Advanced Studies of the Gokongwei College of Engineering, De La Salle University. We'll have first a brief prayer.
Let me be the change I want to see, to do with strength and wisdom all that needs to be done. Let me be the change and become the hope that I can bring, to do with strength and wisdom all that needs to be done. Hesitation and become the hope that I can bring. Set me free from my fears and hesitation. Change I want to see with spirit to face the challenge. Change I want to see if I'm not the light. I can be a star. The change I want to see from you. I'm not the light. Let us start the change. I can see us change. Nothing surface and from you. Let us start the change. Let us start the change I want to see.
Hey, thank you very much for that very brief prayer. To give an introduction to this LaSalle Sustainability Lecture, let us all welcome Dr. Raymond Tan, the Vice President for Research and Innovation of De La Salle University, Manila, Philippines.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. It's my pleasure to begin what is officially the 6th year of the Sustainability Lecture Series. This is a lecture series that was originally conceived in 2020. You may recall those were the dark days of the COVID-19 pandemic. A small group consisting of some colleagues, Professor Kathleen Aviso, Professor Alvin Culaba, and DLSU's Chancellor Emeritus, Dr. Carmelita Quebenco. And I thought that it would be good to organize a monthly activity, which we could hold in conjunction with, or in cooperation with a global LaSallian network of higher education institutions known as IALO, the International Association of LaSalle Universities. This is a network that has members in North and South America, in Africa, Europe, and Asia. So really a global pool of institutions with a common history dating back to St. LaSalle's educational activities in France. We launched the lecture series in January 2021, and we have since rotated the resource persons and sourced them from different members of this global network. Many of them, of course, come from the Philippines, but we've had speakers from Europe and from Latin America and from the United States as well, and North America. And of course, a full half decade has elapsed since the original launch of this lecture series, a platform for sharing sustainability initiatives that take place throughout this network, but with the lectures being held in a manner that's open to the general public. And of course, not only are we live streaming, but we're also putting recordings of most of the lectures in a dedicated YouTube channel. We have also reformed the way we organize behind the scenes. We were joined by Professor Aris Ubando of the Gokongwei College of Engineering since then, and then we joined forces with De La Salle University's University Sustainability Office, or USO, led by Executive Director Nonoy Maralit, to assist in the logistics on a regular basis. So what we have seen is, as we enter the 6th year, this lecture series is still going strong. There is significant interest in what we're doing to address various sustainability challenges. We were originally inspired by both the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the late Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, which both were made public in 2015 and created a roadmap towards a greener future for humanity. This lecture series represents our modest contribution, but it also represents our individual and collective dedication to such a contribution. So we thank you for your support, and we hope that you continue to join us in future editions of this lecture series. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tan, for that insightful introduction of the LaSalle Sustainability Lectures. And it is also my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker for today is Dr. Raymond R. Tan. He is a distinguished full professor of the Chemical Engineering Department of De La Salle University. Dr. Tan is a fellow of the World Academy of Sciences. Dr. Tan is also an academician of the Philippine National Academy of Science and Technology. He has published more than 600 Scopus Index papers, and he is globally recognized in process systems engineering and sustainability field. And to add, he is also one of the editor-in-chief of the Process Integration and Optimization for Sustainability journal. Let us all welcome our speaker, Dr. Raymond R. Tan.
Thank you. Hello again. This time I'm wearing a different hat. I've volunteered as a speaker to share with you some very recent work that began in the 3rd quarter of 2024, and which we completed late last year. I'm now going to share my my slides, and I hope the cover slide is visible now. Can somebody please confirm that you can see the cover slide?
We can see
Yes,
it,
we can
Dr.
see
Tan.
it.
All right, thank you. Now I can proceed. So the title of the talk is, Can Basalt Application in Plantations Decarbonize the Palm Oil Industry? This is, there is going to be an answer at the end of the lecture, of course, but let me just begin by acknowledging that this work is based on a recently published paper in the journal Carbon Footprints. So those of you in the audience who are interested in the technical details and want to do a deep dive, or perhaps some of you may want to do a graduate school thesis on a related topic, you can follow the QR code on the right side of the screen, and that leads you to the full text PDF file which you can then read more closely after the lecture. So the talk itself is going to be just about the highlights, and will not include many of the fine points. This work is the result of a multi-university, multi-country collaboration with 5 other colleagues, whose faces and names you'll see on the screen. Notably, of course, we have 2 universities from the Philippines, DLSU and University of the Philippines, Los Baños. We also have collaborators from Malaysia, Professor Dominic Fu of the University of Nottingham, with whom I've collaborated for nearly a quarter of a century, and Dr. Yin Ling Tan of Curtin University in Eastern Malaysia. And of course, we have Professor Aviso, Dr. Ivan Gue, and Dr. Migo Sumagang from the Philippines. My work on carbon management goes back a long way. In fact, I started on this journey in 1999, trying to do assessment of the environmental impacts of so-called future motor vehicles. And it's significant, the future I envisioned back in 1999 is already the present today. So my work is diversified and moved towards industrial decarbonization, essentially helping provide methodologies and algorithms to allow sustainable industrial systems to be designed for a future planet. And I will begin this talk with this excerpt from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which says simply that CDR, or carbon dioxide removal, will be needed to counterbalance residual emissions. So the talk is going to be about CDR, and it's going to be divided into 4 sections, as you will see here. The whole thing will probably last about 30 minutes. So let's begin with climate change and carbon dioxide removal. The common aspiration based on an international treaty known as the Paris Agreement is to keep the average rise in temperature from human greenhouse gas emissions to a delta, or a change of at most 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial times by the end of this century, so 74 years from now. We are hoping that we can make changes in the industrial systems so that temperature is going to rise, but on average by not more than this. There's actually a stipulation that we want to stay below 2 degrees, but get the warming to as low as possible, as close as we can get to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That apparently is getting more and more difficult to achieve, because there are signs that even today, the average temperature compared to pre-industrial times is already about 1.5 degrees warmer. So we've already hit that particular deadline. Humanity generates approximately 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. And this figure has been going up throughout human history. What we actually need to do to achieve the warming target of well below 2 degrees Celsius is to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions by about the middle of this century. Take note, not to stop the growth of emissions, but to actually reverse the growth so that it vanishes, the net emissions become zero by the middle of the 21st. As a result, majority of the countries on Earth have actually already made pledges to achieve what is called net zero, or carbon neutrality. And as you can see here, that represents a very, not universal, but there's a consensus and an aspiration in the international community to try to contribute to the collective net zero goal at the planetary level. And I have been critical of countries such as the Philippines, which to date have not yet pledged carbon neutrality, and which represents a lack of ambition to build that green future. Malaysia, as you will see, does have a net zero pledge. Now, the country level net zero pledges actually trickled down, because in response to what is envisioned as an inevitable future, corporations that have businesses that span the entire globe already have very ambitious carbon neutrality targets. Take, for example, Apple. 6 years ago, Apple made a public announcement that they are aiming to become carbon neutral by the end of this decade. So we're already past the halfway point. And certainly this kind of pledge mobilizes the corporation to make changes and improvements in their processes and products to help contribute to greening the planet. And this is a pledge that, of course, is reflected in other corporations as well. So many of the companies whose products and services we use have such pledges in place. Some of them, of course, not 2030, but perhaps later in the century. As a result of such pledges, we are seeing a thriving and emerging carbon economy. And that means that there are companies emerging that specialize in providing services to help clean up the emissions of corporations like, say, Microsoft or Apple. This is a form of outsourcing. It simply means that if it makes more sense or it's more efficient for Apple to pay a supplier or an outsourcing corporation to do the cleanup for them rather than doing it in-house, then it becomes a win-win arrangement, and they simply pay for the cleanup services, just as corporations would pay for services to pick up garbage or to dispose of various wastes. So that's the essence of the arrangement. That's a thriving carbon economy that is going to grow in the near future. How far is it going to grow? McKinsey and company actually made a projection several years ago that just this CDR, carbon dioxide removal market, will reach the $1 trillion per year scale by the middle of this century. And that means that the amount of carbon credits being traded will probably approach 10 billion tons per year based on their projections. So this is going to be not just trivial economic activity, but I can imagine this will create a large number of business ventures and job opportunities as well for professionals in the future. So that is the big picture. Now we zoom in on a particular technology for CDR, for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, known as enhanced weathering. What is enhanced weathering? Many rocks and minerals that are slightly alkaline will spontaneously react with rainwater and the dissolved carbon dioxide in rainwater. Rainwater is slightly acidic because it contains carbonic acid, which is dissolved carbon dioxide. When that comes into contact with slightly alkaline minerals, for example, silicates that occur in rocks like basalt, there's a very slow geochemical reaction that results in the sequestration of the carbon. Take note that carbon was originally in the atmosphere, and eventually the conversion that takes place carries the carbon as dissolved bicarbonate ions into the ocean, which means that that process transfers carbon from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere into dissolved ions that stay in the ocean for a long time, millennia. The problem with this geochemical weathering process is it is geologically slow, and therefore it needs to be engineered to accelerate it so that it becomes useful for industrial decarbonization purposes. And this process is known as enhanced weathering. It simply requires taking these materials, these rocks and minerals, and pulverizing them into a fine dust, about the size of, for example, cornstarch or flour. So when you have that kind of fine particle size, the specific surface area becomes very large, and the reactions no longer occur at a geological pace, but at something more significant from a human timescale perspective. This, of course, might sound like science fiction to many of you, but as a matter of fact, there are already early commercial ventures that are trying to use this technique grinding up basalt, for example. You can see in the photograph on the lower left side of the screen, that's basalt. That's the kind of rock that you would mix with cement to make concrete. If you were to take this and grind it into an even finer dust, you could apply it on farmlands, and it serves a dual purpose. As a matter of fact, there's nothing particularly new about the concept of applying rock dust or rock powder to farms. This is a practice that has been done for a long time to adjust the pH of acidic soils. The soil can be made more fertile by taking slightly alkaline minerals and applying that powder on the acidic soil so that it becomes more fertile. So we can apply exactly the same processes, but this time it serves the dual purpose of the soil amendment on the one hand, and in addition to this, the equally valuable contribution of carbon dioxide removal via the weathering reactions that I spoke of. So essentially, you have a tractor that spreads the rock dust on the farmland, and you apply just enough so that it matches the rainfall that you expect. And what actually happens is the rock dust gradually reacts with rainwater and dissolves, and bicarbonate ions that contain the carbon is carried into rivers and eventually into the oceans for long-term or permanent carbon sequestration. So this is something that's already being quote unquote weaponized into actual CDR ventures and businesses. What we need to do next is, of course, imagine what happens from an industrial and economic perspective if we were to do this not at the scale of a few thousand tons per year, but globally, if you were to look at a scale of millions of tons or even billions of tons per year, then things are going to change in the background that may not be immediately obvious if you're just looking at the surface. So this is where academic and scientific research plays an important role. My own research on enhanced weathering dates back to 2019, but together with Professor Aviso, I wrote a 2021 paper which discusses many of these fine points. And if you want to learn more about that, this QR code actually leads to an interview in a podcast about carbon dioxide removal which happened close to 5 years ago, and that should still be online. So feel free to have a look at that or the paper itself if you're interested in the details. What I'm going to discuss today in more detail is enhanced weathering in the context of Malaysia. This is a country I've visited over my professional career nearly 50 times, and I've established close collaborations and relationships with people working in the scientific sector in Malaysia. And one of the things we're going to discuss today is the palm oil industry, which has been highly criticized in international circles because Malaysia is one of the top producers of palm oil in the world, along with other countries like Indonesia, Thailand, Nigeria. Palm oil is the most heavily used vegetable oil in the world for various purposes, either as an edible oil for frying or as an ingredient for making soap and various other non-edible products. And as I said, Malaysia is a significant producer that generates roughly about 20 million tons of crude palm oil per year, distributed throughout the country. Now, critics of this product have pointed out that land use change or deforestation as a result of the expansion of plantations of palm oil creates a major carbon footprint. And this argument is actually a double-edged sword because the carbon footprint of the palm oil product depends heavily on the nature of the land used to grow the oil palm trees where the fruit come from. And of course, the worst case scenario is you cut down tropical rainforests and on peatland, and that generates a large carbon footprint per unit area. But the first subtle point that I need to discuss is The carbon footprint occurs from the expansion of capacity, the expansion of land area, not from the existing farmland. That's an important point to make. And the second point is that if you look at the typical statistics, actually, oil palm as a crop actually has the lowest land footprint of all major commercial oilseed crops. In other words, to produce the same amount of oil, you would need less land using oil palm than using, for example, corn or peanut or rapeseed or coconut for that matter. So the carbon footprint of palm oil as a result of, in some locations, bad land use change practices can be very high. But if properly managed, for example, there are efforts now in different countries, including Malaysia, to have sustainable palm oil certification, which regulates the practice in expanding plantation area. These measures can reduce the carbon footprint of the production of palm oil. And of course, it's also important to note that if we were to phase out palm oil completely and replace it with some other oil crop, we would actually globally incur an even larger carbon footprint because all those other seed crops will need more land area to supply the same amount of oil. So we're stuck in a difficult situation here. What is the actual amount of palm oil being produced? Malaysia generates, as I mentioned, roughly 20 million tons per year. That's not the exact figure, but that's a good order of magnitude indicator of crude palm oil. The lower bound for the carbon footprint of palm oil is about 1 ton of carbon dioxide generated per ton of palm oil. This is an optimistic figure. And of course, if the practices are not very sustainable, then this figure could be an order of magnitude bigger, tenfold the lower bound. And there's a wide range of practices that result in variations in carbon footprint. But let's keep that figure in mind as we go forwards. If we look at Malaysia's historical carbon emissions, whether it's from a production-based accounting or from a footprint perspective, as you will see on the right side of the screen, the nation produces approaching 300 million tons per year of greenhouse gas emissions. In total, that includes, of course, contributions of methane and other minor greenhouse gases. These figures, of course, come from SCP Hat, or this is actually an online environmental footprint platform that was developed by the United Nations Environment Program, and De La Salle University is a science partner that uses this platform heavily for our research and education activities. Dr. Ivan Gray is our principal contact person. So this is the figure that we're looking at, and of course the question is, how much can we decarbonize Malaysia's economy, or in particular the palm oil sector, if we were to apply enhanced weathering? And the modeling framework basically is, if we're trying to envision a future that doesn't exist yet, then the best we can do is we can create a mathematical model that captures the key features of this greener future that we're trying to develop or to envision. And we're using something called environmentally extended input-output analysis. This is an old modeling technique. I'm not going to go into the mathematical details, but not particularly exotic. It's well used by researchers throughout the world. And the idea simply is to imagine a country as being made up of economic sectors that are linked together via their supply chains, and to describe these linkages using linear equations that were developed nearly 100 years ago by Vasily Leontiev, an economist who won the Nobel Prize for this contribution. I'm not going to dive into the details of the model, except to say it may look exotic or intimidating, but these are simple enough to execute in an Excel spreadsheet without too much difficulty. And of course, for somebody who's a novice, it might take a few sessions to learn this technique, but once you know it, it's very easy to execute. And here's an example of data. This is the actual portion of the economic data that we used, published by the Asian Development Bank several years ago. We took a snapshot of Malaysia in 2019. The reason for that is the most recent year on record that is not contaminated, so to speak, by the events of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's the 2019 data. This is simply a large spreadsheet that contains snapshots of Malaysia's economy going back multiple years. And so we took 2019 as the base year. And as you can see, the economy is simply broken down into different economic sectors like agriculture or mining, manufacturing, and so on. And the equations simply represent the buyer-seller relationships among these different economic sectors, taking note that the economic sectors themselves are actually made up of a large number of individual companies or corporations. In particular, we're using what's called an environmentally extended input-output model, which simply means that we, in addition to the economic transactions, we simply add equations that capture the generation of pollutants like greenhouse gases. And in this case, we are using data from the same year in 2019, but drawn from the SCP-HAT platform developed by the United Nations Environment Program. When we did our simulations, these are the key assumptions. Malaysia in 2019 generated 240 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions, carbon dioxide equivalent in that same year. And we simply captured or condensed the Malaysian economy into just 8 economic sectors. But what we also did was we added a new economic sector that doesn't exist yet. And this is the carbon dioxide removal sector. In other words, we envisioned that in the future, there would be an entirely new set of economic activities dedicated simply to cleaning up greenhouse gas emissions, in the same way that there are economic sectors dedicated to garbage collection or sewage treatment. And these are some of the other key assumptions that for any given hectare of oil palm plantation in Malaysia, you could apply 20 to 50 tons of basalt powder per year. So that's a huge variation. And Malaysia, by the way, has about 5.7 million hectares of oil palm plantations. That's roughly 1/6 of the country's total terrestrial land area. Based on literature, we estimate that every ton of basalt will capture anything from 0.15 to 0.2 tons of carbon dioxide. Of course, the trade-off here is that to take the basalt rock from the quarries and to turn it into a very fine powder, which again is about as fine as cornstarch, that requires significant input of electricity for the grinding process, to the tune of, we assume, 180 kilowatt hours per ton of basalt. We're also assuming an average distance for logistics from the quarries to the application sites of about 150 kilometers, and that we assume that as we have an increased requirement for electricity to grind up all of this rock, that the electricity mix of the additional or the marginal generation capacity is the same as what historically exists in Malaysia, which generates 0.6 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour generated. And we assume that the cost of enhanced weathering operations is about $80 or about 250, 300 Malaysian ringgit per ton of basalt, broken down, as you can see, that breaks down as shown on the screen. So these are the assumptions in our simulation, which are all drawn from literature data and some educated guesses from the team. These are the highlights of the result. And as we know, because of the scale of enhanced weathering that occurs over the entire Malaysian territory where palm oil plantations exist, what we're going to see is an increase in the production capacity or the activity in all economic sectors, but particularly pronounced in mining. We have a 25% increase in mining compared to the baseline or current level because, of course, the basalt will have to be mined from quarries, which are present, of course, throughout all of Malaysia. We're going to see roughly a 16% increase in electricity demand relative to current levels or baseline levels, because most of that is going to be to grind up the basalt to the level that is required. And of course, the basalt will have to be shipped from the quarries to the crushing plants and then eventually to the application sites. So the road transport demand is going to increase by 34%. That means a lot of potentially traffic jams occurring throughout the country because of the trucks or lorries moving the goods from point A to point B. So those are the major increases. We also see minor reactions in other parts of the economy. These are not as pronounced as those three sectors. What we will also see is, as a result, in particular, we're going to see major increases in greenhouse gas emissions, shown by the orange line, particularly from the generation of electricity, which in Malaysia makes use of a mix of fossil fuels and renewables. And therefore, we see about 24 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents incrementally being added to the emissions, just because we need more electricity to grind up the basalt. So you see the trade-off here, that the operations are intended to capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but we're actually in the background generating more carbon dioxide to allow these operations to take place for more electricity, more trucks, and so on. So the question is, does the actual carbon dioxide removal offset all of these penalties, or is it a losing proposition? The good news is it is not a losing proposition. We do capture more carbon dioxide than is generated through these additional carbon footprints throughout the economy. Then we can look at some sensitivity analysis of what affects the performance of enhanced weathering. For example, we can vary the application rate, or the capture rate of carbon dioxide could vary. The charts can be read very simply like this. If we look at, for example, chart A, which looks at the effect of high to low levels of application rate, which ranges from 20 to 50 tons per year per hectare. We would just look at the left and right-hand sides of the chart and see whether there's a pronounced difference in the capture rate of the different clusters, because we've simply repeated the simulations at different levels of application. And we can see that the figures, if you look at chart A, the capture rate on the right side is much higher, is visibly higher than on the left side, which means that the application rate of basalt does have a significant effect on the actual magnitude of CDR that occurs in the plantations. By comparison, if we were to look at chart C or D, and if you look at the left and right sides of those charts, there is no pronounced difference between the cluster of points on either side, which means it makes little difference. The variations in the assumptions of those parameters do not make a difference that is visible or significant in the actual effectiveness of this process. So let me summarize the results here. Again, we are applying basalt enhanced weathering we assume that this is applied throughout all of the oil palm plantations in Malaysia. And the result is we are able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 11%, even when we account for the emissions penalties from additional transport and additional electricity. Malaysia would have been producing at the baseline level 240 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. This process, when scaled up to this extent, reduces that by 11% down to 213.7 million tons of CO2. So there is a pronounced effect. Take note that that difference is a reduction of 26 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. There is a caveat, though. The carbon efficiency of CDR is very low because of the emissions penalty. What actually happens is we have to capture or remove 56 million tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through enhanced weathering, and more than half of this is offset by the emissions penalties that occur throughout the economy, and most of it is from electricity production. And therefore, the net reduction is only 26 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. And that simply means that about half of the CDR is wasted by the emissions penalties. We've actually done simulations on what happens if we do this simultaneously with a decarbonization of the electricity supply, reducing the carbon intensity in half, while coupling that with enhanced weathering. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see that the emissions go down all the way to 120 million tons of CO2 per year, which is roughly about half of the current emissions or baseline emissions of Malaysia as a country. So now we're ready for our conclusions and research outlook. And very simply, we started out with the question, can basalt enhanced weathering decarbonize the palm oil industry? And of course, we're doing this in Malaysia, but it could be replicated in Thailand or Indonesia if you wanted. Well, the answer is we have an 11% reduction, or about 26 million tons of CO2 per year. That's the potential net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, which is actually slightly larger than the lower bound, or the optimistic assumption for the carbon footprint of all of Malaysia's greenhouse gas emissions from production of crude palm oil, if the palm oil was being produced sustainably. And of course, that is about 20 to 25 million tons per year. Of course, the actual carbon footprint could go up by an order of magnitude in cases where there are improper practices of oil palm plantation. But what we do know from our calculations is that this will take a significant bite or significant cut in the carbon footprint of the palm oil industry, no matter what assumptions you make about the background or the baseline. So this is not something that is a trivial quantity, but could go a long way towards decarbonizing the industry. What we do know is because the grid, the Malaysian electricity supply, still relies heavily on fossil energy, there is a significant penalty that takes away half of the CDR benefits because of additional greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. So our results actually show that the best results that we could hope for would be that a combination of enhanced weathering plus the decarbonization of the electricity grid would go a long way towards deep emissions cuts throughout the entire Malaysian economy. Now, these results are not quite, there's nothing surprising about this in the sense, because we did a similar study for the Philippines in 2024, and we had very similar results. So that seems to be a consistent and a strong, significant result that might be applicable to a wide range of developing economies in our region. There's also work in the pipeline that we're considering. What if instead of using basalt, we use various industrial wastes for this process, which is actually possible. That is still top secret, so I'm not going to discuss that in more detail. But maybe it'll be a subject of a future lecture via the Sustainability Lecture Series. So once again, those of you interested in a deep dive, please have a look at our paper. This is in an open access journal, so you should have no problem accessing the full text, as well as all of the supporting files that come with it. And of course, we are happy to take your questions. My colleagues and I can entertain your questions, whether in the future, you can of course reach me via my email address, or what we can do is we still have a few minutes this morning to discuss and clarify whatever points you would like to discuss. Thank you once again to everybody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tan, for your insightful talk. So let's give a round of applause to Dr. Tan. So we have a couple of questions posted in our chat box. We have a question from Andrew Pua, and he is asking about the documentation of implemented work on enhanced weathering globally, if this is well documented before commercialization. And his second question is on the sensitivity analysis, whether there are huge differences in the produced results in the sensitivity analysis results.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. There's an extensive literature on enhanced weathering going back decades. I'm proud to say that the very first supply chain optimization paper for enhanced weathering was my work together with Professor Avisa in 2019, first in the world to do that. But there's a wide range of literature, primarily on field trials. So several years ago, there was a field trial in Borneo in eastern Malaysia, applying Basalt exact. In fact, we cited their paper and used their results as basis for some of our modeling assumptions. They used basalt dust in oil palm plantations in Borneo to estimate the carbon sequestration rate. So there is an extensive literature which you can find using Scopus or Google Scholar. But I think the one point that I should emphasize is that almost all of the technological building blocks needed to do enhanced weathering commercially already exists, because all you need are plants to grind the rock into a powder. We have that technology. It's centuries old technology. Trucks or trains to move the material from one place to another. All that is well established. Tractors to apply it. These are also commercially available. The only technology bottleneck really is to measure exactly how much carbon dioxide is captured by this process in real time, because the companies have to sell the credits to companies like Apple or Microsoft. Their customers need to know exactly how much they're buying. There is plenty of research taking place using various sensing techniques to be able to accurately pinpoint how much carbon credits you can sell to your customers if you're doing this in a plantation. I'm sorry, Aris, I'm having a senior moment. What was the second question again?
So the second question is about the sensitivity analysis, if there are any large deviations found in the result.
Okay. Yes. In our paper, we have highlighted that the major sources of variation would depend on, this technique is land limited. So the amount of carbon you can capture is directly related to how much land area you have. And therefore the application rate per hectare is very important. In our assumptions, we went from anything from 20 tons per year to 50 tons per year. 50 is widely used in the literature as sort of the ceiling for doing this. So you can actually go from anything from 0 to 50, depending on, this is also land limited and rainfall limited. What you're trying to do is gradually dissolve the rock dust in rainwater. So this would work in places with high precipitation, like the Philippines or Malaysia. It might not work in a country like Kazakhstan, which is semi-arid. So that is a very important factor. And second also is the chemically, we don't know if there's enough time for the geochemical reactions to proceed to completion. We know that potentially the molecules are there to capture the CO2. Whether there's enough time for this to take place during the time frame of the CDR transactions depends heavily on local climate. And in general, warmer weather is better for enhanced weathering because reactions take place faster when temperatures are higher. So you would not want to do this, for example, in Scandinavia, but you do it near the tropics where you have the appropriate warm weather plus precipitation levels.
Thank you for clarifying that. Actually, that's also one of my questions, if this is suitable for tropical climate. So it seems that this type of technology prefers a more humid tropical climate. So we have another question from Elmar Villota, who is from CLSU UH Manoa. He is working on SAF, and his question is that how does this result impact the potential of Malaysia's palm oil to be a potential SAF feedstock under CORSIA standard?
Well, in general, for as long as you can link the decarbonization to the product, then it's a good thing, because in the future, business transactions are going to be increasingly carbon constrained. So if a vegetable oil is being used to make a green fuel, say to fuel aircraft or to fuel marine vessels, the people making the green fuels want to make sure that their raw materials are themselves sustainable, because the carbon footprint accumulates through the supply chain, and you don't want to be making green fuel using a dirty raw material. Now, in Malaysia, there's a sustainable palm oil initiative which has guidelines on industrial practices which will help ensure that the carbon footprint is manageable or kept to the lowest level. But in general, it's fairly easy to understand the logic behind this, that since the problem is one of land encroachment, the more oil production you can squeeze out of existing plantation or farmland, and by the way, this is an argument that applies to any country that grows any crop, not just to Malaysia and palm oil. The more production you can squeeze out of existing farmland, the less pressure you exert on converting pristine ecosystems to supply human needs. So the idea then is, part of this is optimizing productivity of what already exists so that you live within your means and not convert forest into farmland.
Thank you for that, Dr. Tan. We have another question from Edita Jose, and her question is focused on various CDR technologies. If there are other technologies comparing with enhanced weathering in terms of effectiveness and efficiency, perhaps you can discuss some of those other CDR technologies.
Thank you very much. We should have a long discussion in the near future about CDR. Of course, I'm aware of your recent work on this. Congratulations on that. But enhanced weathering is part of a spectrum of different CDR techniques, and I will, within a couple of minutes, try to discuss the pros and cons of that spectrum. There are so-called nature-based solutions, such as afforestation and reforestation, or blue carbon management using mangroves and seagrass and such, which try to capitalize on photosynthesis to capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. There are geochemical techniques, the first and foremost of which is enhanced weathering, which uses not photosynthesis, but enhanced geochemical reactions to capture carbon dioxide. There are also engineered techniques based on chemical engineering processes known as direct air capture, which actually take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, turn it into a dense supercritical fluid, and then pump it underground into geological reservoirs that act as permanent storage sites. So that is roughly the spectrum of the major competitors. The current global market is dominated by the photosynthesis or the nature-based techniques. More than 99% of carbon credits traded globally are based on some kind of forest management or blue carbon management technique. However, there is a catch here. And let me describe the problem of climate change boils down ultimately to the fact that humanity is taking carbon from geological stocks, coal, oil, and natural gas. This is carbon in geological storage historically. And by burning it, we're transferring that geological carbon into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So if that is the root of the problem, ultimately the core solution that we should be looking for is reversing this process, which is transferring carbon from the atmosphere back into a geological stock that can store the carbon, not for decades, not for centuries, but for what climate researchers refer to as climate relevant timescales. And that means minimum 1,000 years. But you're looking at preferably tens of thousands of years of potential storage. So even though photosynthesis-based mechanisms are highly dominant in current markets, from the perspective of climate relevance, if you happen to live in, say, in Australia or California and have experienced forest fires, you know that it's very difficult to guarantee millennium-scale carbon storage by reforestation. All it takes is a forest fire to reverse all of the capture that you've done when the trees burn and re-release that carbon back into the atmosphere. So in terms of storage durability, that's a term we use in the literature nowadays, the main advantage of enhanced weathering and direct air capture and such techniques is that they're geologically based, and they can actually securely store carbon over climate-relevant timescales of millennia or higher, while the more popular, less expensive techniques, such as reforestation, afforestation, it's very difficult to guarantee anything more than century-scale storage of carbon in a forest, even if it's properly managed. You would need just a pathogen or a forest fire to wipe out your gains very quickly. So these are the pros and cons. Of course, there are also economics. Planting trees is actually cheaper than direct air capture, and it's more to eyes that are prone to greenwashing. These also seem to be more environment friendly until you understand what's actually going on with the carbon. You would think that tree planting is superior, for example, to enhanced weathering in terms of its climate change mitigation benefits, which it is not. So we can have a longer discussion on that, but I hope that overview captures the key debates taking place in the carbon dioxide removal literature.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tan, for sharing the concept of CDR and the various technologies. We have a couple more questions in our chat box. One coming from Heriberto Cabeza, and his question is focused on the if enhanced weathering makes it attractive, or is it basically simple enough for governments to adopt? So,
yeah. Well, thank you, Heriberto, and looking forward to seeing you in a week's time. So, well, enhanced weathering is simple enough and low tech enough to actually execute. And the way this will happen is it will be done by corporations or companies. So what needs to be done would be for government to set up the regulatory framework on, for example, safety and allowable transportation routes for the trucks and trains. So I can envision that it would actually be very easy to scale this up, because almost all the building blocks to do this at an industrially significant scale already exist. And these are mature technologies. Trucks, tractors, quarries, rock crushing plants, these are all things that already exist throughout the world. The only missing ingredient would be techniques to actually measure in real time the amount of carbon that the process sequesters, precisely enough that companies can use the measurements as a basis for dollar or peso or ringgit transactions or payments. So that's the building block that is still missing, and there's plenty of research using techniques that include various chemical assays of the soil, proxy measurements, even using artificial intelligence techniques to make reasonable estimates. These are all in the research pipeline.
thank you for that, Dr. Tan. We have one last question for this session. This is coming from Aldrich Caballo, and his question is that if there are other agents aside from basalt that can be used for enhanced weathering.
Oh, definitely. A wide range of rocks. Rocks and minerals can actually be used for this, including industrial waste. For example, some of my previous work, I've looked at metallurgical slag, For example, when you make iron in a blast furnace, one of the waste materials is something called blast furnace slag, which contains plenty of silicates. Now, the normal practice is they just stockpile this waste. It's really inert. It's basically a rock. It's an artificial rock from an industrial process. So that is normally stockpiled. Geologists have evidence that the stockpiles already undergo enhanced weathering on the exterior surfaces. So if you were to simply take industrial stockpiles or legacy waste from blast furnace plants and grind that up as you would the basalt, you would achieve exactly the same thing. The only difference would be the ratio of the stoichiometric ratio of how much each kilogram of slag will capture from the atmosphere. And again, if you were looking at aluminum mines, there's a substance called red mud, which is a waste material that also could be used for this. So as a final point, I recommend anyone interested to look up the 2019 paper of Phil Renforth in Nature Communications. He's one of the world's foremost leaders in enhanced weathering. His paper gives a top-down estimate of various industrial wastes and how much carbon you could capture if you were to use those wastes.
All right. So I think that wraps up our question and answer for this morning. And let's give a round of applause to our speaker, Dr. Raymond Tan. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise on enhanced weathering.
Yeah, thank you once again to everybody. Please email me if you have any questions about enhanced weathering or CDR.
Okay, so at this point, this is just the first lecture for this year, and we have in store the succeeding lectures in the next coming months. So we would love to hear your feedback for us to improve our delivery of this lecture series. In the screen, you may want to access the QR code or the link provided for your feedback. So again, thank you once again for joining this morning's lecture. See you again on the next session. Again, this is Ari Sobando signing off. Thank you so much. Morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Tan.